Derek, good evening. Thanks very much for your time. Well, it's as much, South Africa's issue with Zimbabwe, that is as much an economic issue as it is a security one, isn't it?
Yes, I think so. I think the South African government must be very worried about the events that took place in Zimbabwe in January. You'll remember there was a massive fuel price hike which led to violent demonstrations and a crackdown by Zimbabwe's security sector, which led to over a dozen people being killed. So this kind of event indicates a fragility and a volatility north of the Limpopo for South Africa, which I think must be an issue of deep concern for the South African government.
But then Southern African heads of state, including South Africa, have no history really of having been successful, at getting Zimbabwe to deal in particular with the security issues that arise as a direct result of instability in Zimbabwe.
Yes, it's a very tricky situation. The immediate political problems are caused by the economic fragility of Zimbabwe. So if the regional leaders were to come out and start condemning the behavior of Zimbabwe's security sector, it presents a very negative image for investors in Zimbabwe. It exacerbates the economic meltdown. It exacerbates the resultant social unrest, and you get into this downward spiral. At the same time, the human rights abuses that took place in January, and which in fact are ongoing, can't possibly be ignored. So there needs, in my view, to be a fairly nuanced approach by the South African government to Zimbabwe's current problems.
But that has been the argument for a very long time. President Thabo Mbeki, during his 2 terms in office, the immediate past president, Jacob Zuma, and now there's a new president. All of them have been arguing for this nudging, of Zimbabwe approach rather than, reading them the Riot Act. And the fact of the matter, which is a point you've made, is that they too, South Africa is an investor. So it is in South Africa's interest to deal with the political and economic situation, which you say then gives rise to the security situation. So at what point do successive South African administrations do this differently in what would hopefully bring about change?
Well, that's why I was saying there needs to be a fairly nuanced approach where one steers between the 2 extremes of an outright condemnation of the Zimbabwean government, which was wholly appropriate in the case of Robert Mugabe because his policies were so economically irrational. We have a completely different kettle of fish in Emmerson Mnangagwa, where at least he's making the right noises around the economy. So those need to be supported, as President Ramaphosa did in his address. But at the same time, one cannot ignore the human rights violations that are going on, the use of live ammunition by the military to crush protests, and this has to be condemned, but condemned in a way which doesn't deter investment. In other words, one needs to encourage the Mnangagwa government to deal with social unrest, which is coming from the economic meltdown, with strict adherence to the rule of law. And any deviation from that requires some condemnation or disapprobation from the South African government. And that's where I think the South African government appears to be falling short. It starts to look then like quiet diplomacy 2.0.
Well, I was looking earlier at some of the utterances that were made there. You had President Ramaphosa asking for a conducive environment for South African businesses that are there, and of course those that also want to go there. And then on the other hand, you had a promise from President Emmerson Mnangagwa that he would indeed protect South African businesses in Zimbabwe. There again, we've been down that road before, haven't we? We've seen South African investors going into Zimbabwe on the back of former President Thabo Mbeki's interventions. But, you know, they don't have much, if anything, to show for it years and years later.
Yes, well, Thabo Mbeki's quiet diplomacy has quite rightly been criticized. But I think the approach that needs to be adopted is quite different from that. There needs to be some encouragement to the Mnangagwa government to abide by the rule of law, and at the same time commend the Mnangagwa government, for example, for abandoning the economically irrational policies of Robert Mugabe. This is where I would disagree with those that would say that Emmerson Mnangagwa is no different from Robert Mugabe. He is at least stating the right policies. Whether he's sincere in implementing them or not is a different issue. But the point is that he needs to be asked to walk the talk, and the South African government should be encouraging, if not pressurizing, the Mnangagwa government to walk the talk around both political and economic reform.
Derek Matushak, thanks very much for your time this evening. He is a senior researcher with the Institute for Security Studies based in Zimbabwe.